shipper faces in the U.S. regarding steamship line behavior that we're challenged by, things that we have to adapt to. We don't know with absolute certainty, but we do with increasing degrees of certainty over experience, do not know necessarily what our capacity is going to be. You know, steamship lines make predictions about what's going to happen in Chicago 3 months from now, but they're not certain what's going to be 3 weeks from now. So that capacity supply issue for us as shippers is a little bit unknown, and as you can imagine, these volatile times, it's very much unknown. The other thing that we have to contend with as shippers is GRIs, or freight changes, which may be very, from a market perspective for the steamship lines, a wise thing to do to respond to the market. But we're selling you on delivered CFR terms where we're guaranteeing freight. We can't lock down that same guarantee with our steamship line, so that's a risk that we take on. We also take on other users of capacity. And the risk of that, you know, you'll sometimes hear the military's loading a bunch of boxes out of Norfolk, so our plant schedule has changed, or food aid, or scrap metal, or waste paper, all paying higher rates, competing for that same capacity. So as sellers, we have to be very cognitive of what our capacity really is when we sell to you. Other things we deal with in terms of the steamship lines, they're not all the same, obviously. They have different rules about weights. They might have different rules about detention time and demurrage times. You guys want to buy on 21 day or 21 free days at your port, understandably so. Steamship lines want to do it at 10 days. Some will do it at 14 days. These are challenges that the shipper has to try to mitigate to comply with its contract with you and increase the trade. Okay, so that's the execution challenges. Let's talk about the competitive forces that we all kind of collectively deal with. When the steamship lines got into this business, I think initially they looked at each other as their competitor. Andy, would you agree? When steamship lines got into the ag business, they really thought that their competitor was another steamship line. And I mean, that was my perspective. Well, Andy, you were a quick learner, I guess. They did eventually learn that their competition wasn't each other. Their competition was dry bulk freight rates. And once they figured that out, they knew that if the world needed freight capacity, you'd see it in dry bulk freight rates. And these guys could sell all the containers that they wanted. They didn't have to worry about what their competitors doing. They had to worry about the marketplace that they're engaged in. So basically, it's their response to dry bulk freight. And really what we're talking about here is what can they do in terms of their response to dry bulk freight. Dry bulk freight for ag products determines the benchmark for moving grain from the U.S. to the Pac Rim. Wherever that benchmark is, steamship lines got to look at that and say, I can compete at that level. I can still cover or recoup all of my incremental costs to taking a load versus an empty and engage that trade. It's a mathematical question for them. And if that math says go, they'll go. If it says don't provide, they won't. So why do they think that way? Well, they're really not in the business of moving ag cargo. Their primary business is moving durable goods to North America and Europe. That head haul, we're the back haul. And where that back haul is available is determined by where the people are. It's determined by where the intermodal ramps are, where the distribution centers are, where that capacity is, if you remember that map that I presented earlier. So that's where the backhaul capacity is available. So how are they going to price that? What are they going to think about? Well, they're going to think about dry bulk. They're going to think about where they want that container to go back to. If you're going to a destination that pays for a reload and it gets them to a destination that they really want that container, they'll take that into consideration in their rate. They have to think about what their rail costs are, whether they have bulk ag surcharges. They have to think about what bunker rates are, how much more capacity or fuel usage is a full container used versus an empty container. You've got to think about usage of that boat capacity for other things. And they got to think about how much storage fees they're paying. If they have a bunch of empty boxes piled up in Chicago and they need to get rid of them in order to avoid $50 a day storage, they'll price it to get it out. Okay, so here's a chart that I've used to kind of monitor the competitiveness of container freight rates to dry bulk. The blue line is the cost per metric ton of moving grain out of New Orleans to the Pac Rim over the last, I guess, 3 to 4 years. The yellow line is the Baltic Panamax Index, kind of tracks pretty close to the actual physical fixture rates. And the maroon line is the cost of moving a container, the freight rate for a container out of Chicago to the Pac Rim. You know, in its most simple terms, whenever the blue line's above the maroon line, we're competitive. We as ag shippers are competitive to offer you something at a price that's cheaper than bulk freight. And when it goes the other way, we're not competitive. And it did go the other way in, I guess, September of last year. And you'll remember the charts about the number of ag containers loaded. It kind of follows this activity, our peaks and our valleys. Recently, we've seen bulk freight come back up, and we've seen the steamship lines respond to that a little bit, but they're not killing the business. Steamship lines are getting much smarter about valuing, pricing their capacity. They're paying attention to the dry bulk freight rates. And here, you'd say that they gave away a lot of freight margin opportunity. Here, they did not respond quick enough to compete with dry bulk. So once they changed their tune in Q1, dry bulk came back, we started loading their containers again. For us as ag shippers, though, we look at this and we realize our margins are extraordinarily thin today compared to what they would have been, a year and a half ago. So we have to spend a lot of time paying attention to all of our contract risks. There's no margin for error, our execution risks. And that seems to me the mode that we're in now for a long time. I think the steamship lines will do a very good job of pricing their product to leave some margin, but not a lot of margin. I think what will happen is the ag transloaders are going to have to be extraordinarily efficient at loading, very good at buying and originating at cheap prices, and operating a supply chain that's just lights out, because they cannot afford to have hiccups. They can't afford to pay GAFTA fees. I mean, I've had trades where, for whatever reason, I might have missed the shipment window by 5 days and paid a GAFTA fee, and that was all my margin. So we don't have a lot to fight over. I think there's probably 25% today the number of transloaders that were in the market a year ago. Now I want to talk a little bit about, though, that we're not as price competitive as container loaders. Our volume's down, but is it really all about price? And you've experienced these attributes, you've heard these attributes before, and I believe them to be true. I mean, a container does have inherent properties to it that are much more advantageous than bulk ag. One of those things is quality of the product. You know, I used to say that and didn't really have a